Let's talk some sneaky waiver wire ads for week 8 of the fantasy football season. As always, we'll give you some quarterbacks, some running backs, some receivers, and some tight ends. These are guys who tend to be lower owned. We're not talking 45% roster rate, so we're digging a little bit deeper here. Let's start at quarterback, and we got to begin with Joe Flacco. Available in 95% of ESPN leagues heading into the week. 19, 26 fantasy points in the 2 games since taking over as a starter for Cincinnati. He's peppering Jamar Chase. T. Higgins even came alive on Thursday night against the Steelers. And, we saw Cincinnati run the ball well, really for the first time all season. I'm not sure that's something we can count on going forward. It was nice to see Chase Brown get on track. I think that was more about the Pittsburgh defense than it is some emergence of the Cincinnati running game. So the bottom line is this is going to continue to be a high volume passing offense. You look at the immediate future here. Good schedule spot against the lowly 0-7 New York Jets in week 8. Jets defense has played well over the last couple of weeks. Still 29th in EPA per pass on defense. Given up 13 passing touchdowns already this season. Sauce Gardner, of course, went out in week 7. So I'm not saying I'm rushing to get Joe Flacco into my lineup, but he should be rostered, of course, in Superflex leagues. And look, we got 6 teams on bye in week 8. No Jared Goff, no Matthew Stafford, no Sam Darnold, Kyler Murray / Jacoby Brissett, Trevor Lawrence, all on buys. If you need a fill-in, I think you can confidently start Joe Flacco at this point. On the other side of that TNF game, got to talk Aaron Rodgers. He's still available in about 75% of ESPN leagues and up to nearly 18 fantasy points per game on the season. That puts him around QB 15, QB 16 on the year. So not a guy who's an every week starter, but definitely someone you can plug in based on the matchups. Big spot this week at home for the Pittsburgh Steelers, a personal revenge game for Aaron Rodgers with the Green Bay Packers coming to town. Green Bay has been a solid defense, more so against the run than the pass, giving up 19.9 fantasy points per game, 2 quarterbacks on the season, 10 passing touchdowns allowed in 6 games. That secondary certainly showing some cracks in recent weeks. So Steelers defense, to me, it's a problem right now. I think Green Bay is going to have success offensively. That's bad in real life for Pittsburgh. Good for fantasy. I think we could see that volume again. And again, 6 teams on bye this week. So if you need a fill-in, take a look at Joe Flacco. Take a look at Aaron Rodgers. Another quarterback just to keep on your radar right now, J.J. McCarthy out in Minnesota. And really, this is more of like a speculative ad on a second quarterback in Superflex. We know how difficult those quarterbacks are to lock down. You kind of have to do it ahead of time. The timetable for the ankle remains up in the air. Vikings have already had their bye week. Adam Schefter initially said, 2, 3, 4 weeks. Now it sounds like it might not be until week 9 when we see J.J. McCarthy back. Either way, I expect him to retake the reins of this offense at some point. Hard to know what to expect from McCarthy, given that we have such a small sample size so far this season. You're hoping for a decent rushing floor. We'll see what that arm ends up looking like. But at the end of the day, he's got 2 elite weapons in Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. Hasn't played with Jordan Addison yet this season. You got TJ Hawkinson in there at tight end. You got a reliable running game with Aaron Jones coming back, Jordan Mason as your high-end pivot. So this should still be a productive offense, and the hope is that J.J. McCarthy doesn't take away from that. Let's move on to the running back position. We got to start in the NFC North with Kyle Monangai. Saw his highest snap share of the season against New Orleans in Week 7, 46% total snap share for Monangai, 31 snaps. That was also a season high. DeAndre Swift was banged up coming into that game, but I thought he looked great. Even with Swift running well, Ben Johnson was still turning to Monangai throughout this game, and Bears ended up winning fairly comfortably, but it was never a blowout. 36 snaps for DeAndre Swift, 31 for Monangai, 19 carries for Swift, 13 for Monangai. Had a couple of catches on 3 targets, of course, found the end zone for the first time in his NFL career. All season, Ben Johnson has talked about wanting to get another back involved beyond DeAndre Swift. I think that's going to be Monangai going forward. Again, you look at that line, 13 carries, 81 yards, and a touchdown. We're seeing plenty of work on 3rd downs. And you look at the matchups coming up for this Bears team. They get the Ravens and the Bengals the next 2 weeks, 2 bottom 5 run defenses on the season. Ravens are getting some pieces back, but even when they were healthy early in the year, this was still not a good run defense. And of course, when it comes to the Bengals, Jaylen Warren just put up 127 yards, 7.9 yards per carry on that Bengals defense. We'll run through a couple deeper options at running back. I think you got to take a look at Bam Knight for the Arizona Cardinals. Was clearly the guy in Week 7 over Michael Carter. Outsnapped Carter 34-28, outcarried him 14-7, drew 4 targets in the passing game. Saw the majority of the short yardage work, most of the early down work. A little bit disappointing from a touchdown perspective. Cardinals returning to Trey McBride, understandably so, in the red zone. But we've seen Bam Knight be used in that role in recent weeks. Now, the Cardinals are on a bye in week 8. Amari DiMercato could be back in the mix after the bye. So there are some complicating factors here. Make sure you keep an eye on DiMercato's status. But in deeper leagues, I still don't mind picking up Bam Knight in the event that DiMercato does remain out or he's still in the doghouse after that disaster against Tennessee. There will be touchdowns to be had in this Cardinals running game, and Bam Knight, at least for now, feeling like the best bet. Keep an eye on Isaiah Davis for the New York Jets. Jets have just not done anything on offense the last couple of weeks against Denver and Carolina. It's looking like Justin Fields might be losing his job. The Jets are 0-7. It's a disaster. Nonetheless, take a look at Davis. Breece Hall, still obviously the go-to guy for the New York Jets, but they do use Isaiah Davis in the passing game. He's on the field in some third down situations. Realistically, it'll probably take an injury to Breece Hall or a trade for Davis to be truly usable in fantasy leagues, but it's still a situation to monitor ahead of the trade deadline. Jets are 0-7. Season is over. Maybe, just maybe, they would be open to moving Breece Hall, and in that case, you're kind of going in the tank, and you're probably feeding Isaiah Davis quite a bit the rest of the way. Another back to take a look at, Devin Neal of the New Orleans Saints. So Kendre Miller was the guy that we've been pushing up in this video the last few weeks. He'd been cutting into that snap share for Alvin Kamara. Well, on his second snap of the game, he tore his ACL in week 7 against Chicago. So he is done for the year. That should push Devin Neal in as the Saints RB2 now behind Kamara. It was Neal who filled in right away after Miller went down. Really didn't see a whole lot of him throughout that game. If anything, this might just be more of a boost to Alvin Kamara going forward. But either way, still worth keeping an eye on in the off. But either way, still worth keeping an eye on in the off chance that Alvin Kamara is traded. I know he said he will not be traded. We will see. I think it's likely that he remains in New Orleans, but you never know. Saints are trending in the wrong direction. Alvin Kamara is certainly liable to get hurt at some point. Probably needs that injury to Kamara, does Devin Neal, for him to truly be relevant here. But we had already seen Kamara lose some snaps to Kendre Miller in recent weeks. Maybe Neal is the type of guy who has to earn that privilege to take snaps away from a veteran in Kamara. But if nothing else, he is now the very clear backup for the New Orleans Saints. Moving on to the wide receiver position, Alec Pierce. First guy I have on my list here of the Indianapolis Colts, just 3.1% rostered in ESPN leagues. He was dropped in a lot of formats, missed a couple of games earlier in the season with a concussion. Went 2 for 48 last week against Arizona, 5 for 98 on 10 targets this past week against the LA Chargers. Now, the Colts were without Josh Downs in that game, so keep that in mind. Probably not a long-term concussion absence for him. But the Colts are increasingly comfortable going to all 3 of their primary receivers. Plus, you have Tyler Warren, Jonathan Taylor mixing in that passing game. It does make it tough to evaluate, but Pierce, no matter what, always seems to find a way to rip off 1 or 2 big plays every week. If Downs is back in week 8, that obviously hurts, but Pierce is still someone I like to have on my bench as a fill-in option. It's been the most efficient, the highest scoring offense in the league in Indy so far this season. So I'm willing to trust a depth piece for the Colts more than I am just about any other team in the NFL right now. And once again, we have 6 teams on bye. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Jacoby Myers, Puka, Devontae Adams, Marvin Harrison, JSN, Brian Thomas, Travis Hunter. They're all off the table in week 8. So if you need some depth, go grab Alec Pierce. Next on the list is Kayshon Boutte of the New England Patriots. So volume is a concern here in New England. He has just 2 games with 5+ targets on the season so far. They use a lot of options in that passing game, but Boutte continues to cash in when the opportunities are there. 2 for 55 and a touchdown against Tennessee. He's coming off of 5 for 93 and 2 touchdowns in the New Orleans game. New England plays Cleveland in week 8. Would expect Cleveland to be able to slow down the rushing attack for New England. Should be a higher volume game for Drake May at home. Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers. So through the first couple of weeks, it looked like Legette was just trending toward being a total bust. 4 catches on 15 targets first 2 weeks of the season, but you got to give credit where it's due, man. He's come on of late, had some big plays in that win over Miami in week 5. Pretty quiet against Dallas in week 6. Then he goes 92 yards on 9 catches, 11 targets last week against the New York Jets. Still second behind Teteroa McMillan in routes and snaps. That's going to be the case every week. But McMillan saw only 5 targets in that game. Jets did a good job taking him away. Obviously, the Panthers want McMillan to be the guy in this offense. But even with Jalen Coker back in week 7, Legette was still the most productive piece in that passing game. Panthers now likely to be without Bryce Young for at least 1 week, possibly more weeks. Credit to Bryce Young for getting the Panthers to 4-3. I don't really think pivoting to Andy Dalton is a bad thing necessarily for this offense. I don't think we see much of a drop-off. Panthers get the Bills in week 8. This is Buffalo coming off a bye, coming off of back-to-back losses. Should be a run-first spot on paper for Carolina. That Bills run defense has not been good this season, but also very possible they'll be trailing for large portions of this game. So tough situation right now to figure out with so many variables. Coker likely to intrude on Legette's workload at some point, but hard to go away from Xavier Legette right now, given what we saw on Sunday. We'll finish out with a couple names at tight end. Look, this guy is by no means sneaky anymore, given what we've seen the last 2 weeks, but still only 2.1% rostered in ESPN leagues. Oronde Gadsden of the LA Chargers went 7 for 68 on 8 targets last week against Miami, 7 for 164 on 9 targets this past week against the Colts, 40 more yards than any other tight end has had in a game this season. Obviously, it was a pass-heavy script for the Chargers, fell behind early in that game, had to try to throw their way back into it, but there's been a concerted effort for the Chargers to get Gadsden more involved. 78% snap share the last 2 weeks. That's even with Will Dissly back in the mix. In the Miami game, they didn't have Quentin Johnston. Got him back this week. Still saw Gadsden heavily involved. You might not be able to depend on 8-9 targets every week if the Chargers keep these games closer, but the way this defense is playing right now, I think this is a team that will be in plenty of shootout. We'll finish out with one more tight end, Colston Loveland of the Chicago Bears. What Tyler Warren is doing for the Colts, I think it's kind of overshadowing Colston Loveland so far, and rightfully so. He hasn't done a whole lot for the Bears. Did have a career-high explosion for 3 catches, 24 yards against New Orleans in Week 7. Obviously nothing earth-shattering there, but the Bears did lose Cole Kmet to a back injury, still TBD as to whether he'll miss time. So keep an eye on Cole Kmet's status going forward, but either way, we started to see Colston Loveland creep in on that playing time in Week 6. It happened again in Week 7, even before the injury. Saw more of Loveland early in that game, ended up with a 43% snap share and just 51% for Cole Kmet 2 weeks ago. That was significantly lower than any number he had through the first 3 or 4 games. The problem here is that the Bears, while fairly productive on offense, they're running the ball well, they're throwing to wide receivers. They have the 4th lowest target rate for tight ends in the NFL. So Caleb Williams just not really looking Kmet's way, not really looking Loveland's way all that much. But 2 pretty appealing matchups coming up. You get Baltimore and you get Cincinnati over the next 2 weeks. Baltimore 26th in the NFL in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Cincinnati dead last. Over 22 fantasy points allowed to tight ends per game. Obviously, we just saw 3 different tight ends catch a touchdown against that Cincinnati defense for the Pittsburgh Steelers on Thursday night.